just hold it down till it.
She'll go up the door and stand, look back at nobody sees her. She'll come to one of us and take that paw, smack us on the leg, and go back to the door.
That's about like my German Shepherd. She'll come over and hit you with her nose and then go to the door.
This is usually the paw, though.
Yeah, it seems like they're Casey, our
Okay. We've got new equipment.
Getting a little feedback. We're getting an echo.
Hello. Okay.
Doesn't he turn the speakers on? Okay.
Okay. All right. I think we got it going now. Our computer was taking the sound back. Hopefully it'll work for us a little bit better this morning. Hope everybody's had a good week, and we've had a real cold morning, but it's turning out to be really warm. Now looked like we had light snow this morning when I first went out, but it's gone at this point. We're going to pick back up on our study of David, and the last couple weeks we have studied about his repentance and then his praise to the Lord for forgiving him. We're going to look back closer into David's life, and we remember a few weeks ago we had talked about when he had sinned with Bathsheba and had her husband killed, that Nathan the prophet had brought this up in front of him and told him what he had done, even though he thought it was in secret. And if we remember that also that one of Nathan's prophecies to him was that the sword would never leave his family. So we're going to go back this morning. I was going to go back a little bit, trying to pick up as much as we can about David while we're studying about him. And the lessons we aren't able to do verse by verse because there's so much written about David's life in here. But we'll go back and pick up a little bit of what's gone on in between of our study last time when he brought this out. One thing I wanted to read to you that we hadn't looked at before, when the Israelites came out of Egypt, the Lord had given them, in the book of Deuteronomy, it talks a lot about what the ways that they were to live, the things that they were to do, the observances, the worship of the Lord, and just how they were to conduct themselves. Like I say, they had been in Egypt and they had seen a whole lot of worship of many other gods at this point. So God was setting up the worship for them to the one true God. And if you have your Bible and want to turn to Deuteronomy chapter 17, and we're going to start at verse 14. And it's talking about the king. When the Israelites had a king over them, exactly what that kingship was to be like. And then we'll talk about this. But this is just a little overview that we probably should have done a couple weeks ago. But Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 14 starts out, when you enter the land the Lord your God is giving you, so that's when he's taken them into the promised land that he's given them, and have taken possession of it and settled it, and you say, let us set a king over us like all the nations around us, which is what we saw exactly what they did. Be sure to appoint over you the king the Lord your God chooses. He must be from among your own brothers. Do not place a foreigner over you, one who is not a brother Israelite. The king, moreover, must not acquire great numbers of horses for himself or make the people return to Egypt to get more of them, for the Lord has told you, you are not going back that way again. He must not take many wives, or his heart will be led astray. He must not accumulate large amounts of silver and gold. When he takes the throne of his kingdom, he is to write for himself on a scroll a copy of this law, taken from that of the priests who are Levites. It is to be with him, and he is to read it all the days of his life, so that he may learn to revere the Lord his God and follow carefully all the words of this law and these decrees, and not consider himself better than his brothers and turn from the law to the right or to the left. Then he and his descendants will reign a long time over his kingdom of Israel. So the first thing we want to talk about is one of the things over that. It says about the king in verse 17, he must not take many wives or his heart will be led astray. So there's a couple things especially this morning I wanted to read about that. But as we know from our studies of David for the last few weeks, David had taken many wives. Not only Bathsheba, but that we had studied about, but he had King Saul had given him his daughter as a wife, and he had many concubines. So David had a lot of wives, and that had to have led to a lot of confusion, and he had children by many wives. So with David being king, that there was probably a big scuffle, thinking who was going to be successor to the throne, and there had to be a lot of turmoil in the family because of this thing he's done. So this morning, and going back just a little bit before we read the verses for today, I wanted us also to go back and look at chapter 13 of 2 Samuel, chapter 13. This is kind of in between where we studied last time and where we're going this time. Just so we know what's going on and why the lesson today is happening. If we don't look at this, it's kind of confusing. So at the beginning of chapter 13, 2 Samuel chapter 13, it says, "In the course of time, Amnon, son of David, fell in love with Tamar, the beautiful sister of Absalom, son of David." So Amnon was a son of David by one wife, and Absalom and Tamar were sons and daughters by another wife of David's. They shared the same father but different mothers. And Amnon fell in love with Tamar because she was a beautiful young lady, and he was trying to devise a plan that he could have her, which it was against the rules at the time. He was not to be married. So a friend of his, and I noticed that this friend, he comes up later. He comes to David and he helps him, or to Amnon, and helps him to devise a plan. He tells him to act like he's sick and to ask his father David if he could send Tamar over to take care of him while he's sick. So he did that. David came to check on him, I guess, while he was ill, and he asked that Tamar be sent to take care of him and to fix him something to eat and to help him feel better. And once she came over there and she was doing the things that she was asked to do, and he asked the servants to leave the room, to leave them alone. And it says he had sent everyone out of him. And he says, "Come to bed with me, my sister." This is starting in verse 11. She says, "Don't, my brother," she said to him, "don't force me. Such a thing should not be done in Israel. Don't do this wicked thing. What about me? Where could I get rid of my disgrace? And what about you? You would be like one of the wicked fools in Israel. Please speak to the king. He will not keep me from being married to you." But he refused to listen to her, and since he was stronger than she, he raped her. Then Amnon hated her with intense hatred. And then once this act had happened, it says he hated her more than he ever loved her at that point, and he had his servants to put her out. And at this point, he had shamed her. The king's daughters at the time wore royal robes, before they were married, and she was not able to do this. He had shamed her, even though it was between the people involved. So he asked the servant, to put her out the door, and he threw her out. And then in verse 20, so I'll start at verse 19. It says, "Tamar put ashes on her head and tore the ornamented robe that she was wearing. She put her hand on her head and went away weeping aloud. Her brother Absalom said to her, 'Has that Amnon, your brother, been with you? Be quiet now, my sister. He is your brother. Don't take this thing to heart.' And Tamar lived with her brother Absalom's house, a desolate woman." When King David heard all this, he was furious. Absalom never said a word to Amnon, either good or bad. He hated Amnon because he had disgraced his sister. So this thing has happened. Tamar went back to her brother, who she told what had happened, and she was very shameful about what had happened. David, it said that David was furious, but it doesn't say that he did anything, that he did anything to reprove Amnon of what he had done to his sister. But we also see that Absalom, Tamar's natural brother, was really mad, and this is something that stewed in his heart because of what had been done to him. And I don't know, maybe he felt like nothing was taken, but this is just something that he had in his heart for him. It says 2 years later, Absalom, the brother of Tamar, he and his men were out shearing sheep, and he asked David to come and join them, and David refused. He said, there'll be too many people, we'll get too many away from the capital, and this will just be a burden to you. So Absalom said, can all my brothers come and be with me? And, he had 2 years at this point to stew and to fester the madness of what was going on. So he had a plan once they all came together. He had his servant murder Amnon, his brother. So, even though it didn't happen right away, he had stewed on this, and he took vengeance and had the brother murdered. And it says once this happened, Absalom fled and went to Talmai, son of Amminahub, the king of Geshur. But King David mourned for his son every day. After Absalom fled and went to Geshur, he stayed there 3 years, and the spirit of the kings longed to go to Absalom, for he was consoled concerning Amnon's death. So Absalom left the country after that because he knew what he'd done wasn't a good thing, but he did this to defend his sister, but he'd also killed his elder brother for him. And it said that David mourned for him. He knew even when your kids do bad and you don't just stop your feelings for them, what they did. So David mourned for him while he was gone. And this king that he went to, according to the lesson writer, looked like maybe this was an in-law of his that he is why he fled there. So we're going to start this lesson in chapter 15 and verse 1. Okay, I'll read these verses and then we'll talk about them. Well, there's one, I was thinking I was leaving something out for you. In the meantime, Joab, who's the general of David's army, realized that David really wanted Absalom to come home to him. So he devised a plan, and he sent a woman to act like her son had done something wrong, to tell David of a story of how her son had done wrong and how he was sent away, and she wanted him to come, really trying to get David to see the plight of what was happening in his family. And, Joab knew he wanted him back, and he wanted to help him to get Absalom back. So the plan worked. David did allow Absalom to come back in the country, but at first he had asked that he didn't see Absalom during the time that he was able to come back, but he wasn't able to come and be in the presence of the king. And this is in verse 14. Sorry, I about didn't go over that. And one thing in the future part of this verse, in verse 25, it said, "In all Israel there was not a man so highly praised for his handsome appearance as Absalom, for from the top of his head to the sole of his foot there was no blemish." So apparently he was a very good-looking, beautiful man, I guess, for lack of words. But and we'll find out later some of the, sometimes that's good, and it's easier to get people to follow you if these are part of your qualities. If we remember back when they were picking David, that he was the last choice of in the people's eyes of what to pick, because he didn't have all these beautiful qualities, and he wasn't a big muscled man or anything like that. So it says, Absalom lived 2 years in Jerusalem without seeing the king's face. So he went back to Joab and he said, "Why have you brought me back here if I can't see the king's face?" And he asked, he said, take me before him, and if it's his choice to kill me, then let him kill me, because he says I'm like a prisoner, like I was here. And in the very last verse of chapter 14, and it says, he went before the king, and it says, and the king kissed Absalom. So the king loves his son regardless. He forgave him, at this point for what he did. I'm sure he never forget, but his love for his son overruled the things that have happened. David didn't hold this grudge forever over top of him, and we know from the past that David has had much forgiveness for what he's done, so hopefully he was able to give forgiveness in return for what he had received. Okay, so now we're going to get on the lesson for today, starting at 2 Samuel chapter 15. It's verse 1 through 12. It says, and it came to pass after this that Absalom prepared him chariots and horses and 50 men to run before him. And Absalom rose up early and stood beside the way of the gate. And it was so that when any man that had a controversy came to the king for judgment, then Absalom called unto him and said, O what city art thou? And he said, Thy servant is one of the tribes of Israel. And Absalom said unto him, See, thy matters are good and right, but there is no man deputed of the king to hear thee. Absalom said moreover, O that I were made judge in the land, that every man which hath any suit or cause might come unto me, and I would do him justice. And it was so that when any man came nigh to him to do him obeisance, he put forth his hands and took him and kissed him. And on this manner did Absalom to all Israel that came to the king for judgment. So Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel. And it came to pass after 40 years that Absalom said unto the king, I pray thee, let me go and pay my vow which I have vowed unto the Lord in Hebron. For thy servant vowed a vow while I abode in Jeshurun at Syria, saying, If the Lord shall bring me again indeed to Jerusalem, then I will serve the Lord. And the king said unto him, Go in peace. So he arose and went to Hebron. But Absalom sent spies throughout all the tribes of Israel, saying, As soon as ye hear the sound of the trumpet, then ye shall say, Absalom reigneth in Hebron. And with Absalom went 200 men out of Jerusalem that were called, and they went in simplicity, and they knew not anything. And Absalom sent for Ahithophel the Gilonite, David's counselor, from his city, even from Gilah, while he offered sacrifices. And the conspiracy was strong, for the people increased continually with Absalom. So we see Absalom has come back into town now that he's gotten forgiven, and he's come back in a big way. It says that it came to pass after Absalom prepared him chariots and horses and 50 men to run before him. And if we remember from what we read about in Deuteronomy about the kings and how they should present themselves, horses weren't something that the Lord wanted the king of Israel or the kingship to have a lot of, because of, the horses. If you've seen back in the day when they were fighting, the horses and the chariots, when you saw an army come against another army and one had lots of horses and chariots, what you saw from that was a strength in those horses, and the Lord was to be the Israelite strength. He didn't want people to look upon and think of the might of these charioted riders, but that the Lord was their might. So Absalom has come on the scene, and he's first thing done something against. He's building him up pomp and splendor, I guess we'll call it, to go with his good looks. Now he's got some good looking horses and chariots and men, so he's making a show in, I guess, that sometimes people will say. And verse 2 says, And Absalom rose up early and stood beside the way of the gate. And so it was that when any man that had controversy came to the king for judgment, then Absalom called up to him and said, O what city? And he said, Thy servant is one of the tribes. So, Absalom has made himself at the very forefront when people come into the city, if they have problems, to try to be the one that helps them to look at these problems. And it says, and Absalom said unto him, See, thy matters are good and right, but there is no man deputed of the king to hear them. So he's not only up there trying to make himself judge over the people, but he's also saying, for some reason it seems that David has got a little bit of slack in doing this right now, in this judgment and helping people with this. So Absalom's saying, if the king would have done something like this, if the king would have listened. So, you see, he's really starting to pluck at David's armor and to make his way in and to turn people's favor to him as the good guy who cares about you. In verse 4 it said, Absalom said moreover, Oh, that I were made judge in the land, that every man which hath any suit or cause might come unto me, and I would do him justice. So if you were a person that, I'm going to say, was being wronged or even thought he was being wronged, I don't think you would necessarily have to truly be that. But and you come to this man who's sitting at the gate, who is pretending to care about every part of your life, he's going to gain your favor. I mean, he's just going to do it by what he's doing. And especially if the king isn't doing that, then, one person's going to go and say, well, if you go to Absalom, he'll listen to you, and he's just like a brother. So, some people that, or I would say most people that plot these devious things, they're good at what they do. That's what their specialty is. Yeah. Yes, can convince you of anything. And it said in verse 5, and it was so that when any man came nigh unto him to do, I'm not sure how to pronounce this word, obeisance, he put forth his hand and took him and kissed him. So, sounds like a little bit like politicians to me. I mean, he's kissing babies and stuff at this point, but he's endearing himself to these people. I mean, somebody that you think is high above you, that's willing to do this for you, you're going to take note of it once they do this. And it says, and on this manner did Absalom to all of Israel that came to the king for judgment. So Absalom stole the hearts of the men in Israel. So we see his plans work, and the people are looking to him. They're coming to him with their problems. He's appearing to have empathy and care for what happens to them, and even for the king's son to kiss you, I guess would be something that you wouldn't. And the lesson reader, it says, had said earlier, he said he had all the pomp and all the pleasure he could wish, yet this will not content him unless he has power too. He that should himself have been judged to death for murder had the impudence to aim at being judge of others. So this is the same man, we remember, that had plotted to kill his brother for the last 2 years, and now he wants to pass judgment over all people. And and he's not even really doing this for the right reason. He noted that Absalom wants power, and that's what the underlying reason for all this appearance of love and sympathy for the people of the kingdom. And in verse 7 it says, And it came to pass after 40 years that Absalom said unto the king, I pray thee, let me go and pay my vow which I have vowed unto the Lord in Hebron. I'm going to go ahead and do 8 and 9. For thy servant vowed a vow while I abode at Jeshurun in Syria, saying, If the Lord shall bring me again indeed to Jerusalem, then I will serve the Lord. And the king said unto him, Go in peace. So he arose and went to Hebron. So Absalom, if you notice, he's kind of doing a little bit like David with Bathsheba. Remember, he saw Bathsheba, he had her brought to his house, he had her husband. Once he started, it is like a snowball. It kept getting bigger and bigger. And we see Absalom's lies and deceit are getting bigger and bigger as he goes. he says, I vowed unto the Lord at Hebron. So he's not only lying to the people now, he's bringing the Lord into it. And he's saying, I made a vow unto the Lord in Hebron that if he goes back, that he should come and serve him. And if we remember, Hebron is the place where David first had set up the kingdom. When he became king, he was in Hebron, and then later, we remember we talked about it, he was moving the ark, and he set up Jerusalem as the capital where his kingship would be. So we see that through deceitful and saying that I'm serving the Lord, I want to go back to Hebron and finish this vow that I've made to go back and serve the Lord for it. It says, the writer in the book says, it was an act of religious hypocrisy amounting to profanity. And it says, hypocrite though he was himself, he well knew the depth and sincerity of his father's religion. He knew, too, that nothing could gratify him more than to find his son the evidence of a similar state of heart. So, Absalom's working on his daddy, too, by letting him to go back, because he knows what his dad's relationship with the Lord has been. And as we all know, you want your child to have a relationship with the Lord, and to hear him say, let me go back and let me honor the Lord for what's happened in my life. And David did it. David said, go back and do this thing, thinking that that's what he was doing. And apparently David, from what we learned, David truly believed that this wasn't stuff that he was a little bit skeptical about what was going on. And in some ways, I guess, when we look back at David's life and the things with his children, that
Being king was apparently the utmost thing in his life at the time. The battles took him away. He had several children, as we read, that suffered because of the lack of having their dad. Sometimes we think things are more important when really the most important thing in our life is these kids. We've got a limited amount of time we get to spend with them to train them and do these things that
he apparently missed because he was doing battle and he was securing lands for Israel. And as we can see here, some of these things are coming back to fruition, as well as we had studied that Nathan had told him, that these things would happen in your family. In verse 10 it says, but Absalom sent spies throughout all the tribes of Israel, saying, as soon as you hear the sound of the trumpet, then you shall say, Absalom reigneth in Hebrew. So he's building up his strength in this kingdom. He's got these people that he have judged, that they've gone back and they've told other people. And David at the time, it was a peaceful time in the land, and David apparently was kind of laying down and slacking a little bit on his rule, and Absalom was taking advantage of it. And it says, and with Absalom went 200 men out of Jerusalem that were called, and they went in their simplicity, and they knew nothing. So he took a group of men out of the capital city where his dad was reigning. And according to the book, or the writer here, it says, the 200 guests whom Absalom had invited to take part with him in his sacrifices were doubtless prominent and influential citizens of Jerusalem that were entirely ignorant of Absalom's purposes. So these men he drew out of the city that were probably somebody in the city, because if he took peasants, nobody would probably even notice or miss them or think anything about it. But he was able to lure this band of unknowing men, but they also, made a showing of support for him when they did that. It appeared that, they were backing Absalom as he was leaving and doing this. And in verse 12, it says, and Absalom sent for, Ahithophel, a Gilonite, David's counselor from his city, even from Gilo, while he offered sacrifices. And the conspiracy was strong, for the people increased continually with Absalom. So he has not only taken prominent men from the city, he's now taken his dad's counselor with him, and he has gone with him. So he's really striking blows to David, really close to home. It says the rebellion proved to be popular in general. It was at first a great success. As soon as David heard of it, he proposed flight from Jerusalem. He would not fight against his own loved son. David's kind nature induced him to spare Jerusalem the horrors of a siege. It must also be remembered that in a time of peace, David had no standing army with which to resist a sudden attack, and so expected a quarter. His flight was not from cowardice, but from prudence, for he felt that he should be fighting against God. So he appears as a penitent man rather than a vigorous captain. So, David doesn't just try to make up an army and go after his son who he loves, his city who he loves, to go in. It's a civil war at this point. It's not like the things he's done in the past that he's fought against. It's within his own country, and the writer brings to a point that he doesn't want to go against his son or his country or against his God. He says that David might have been having thoughts at this time of what Nathan had told him about his family and that there would be blood, and questioning, was this God's plan? Is this God's punishment against me for the things that happened? So, David didn't act rashly at this time without going before the Lord to do it, even though the things that his son had done against him. So we see, David has been in his lifetime through like the COVID. I think when I was saying it, when you look at the numbers, the crisis and stuff, he was anointed king of Israel. He killed Goliath. He was anointed king of Israel. Saul came after him. Spent many years after him. Then upon Saul's death, David became king. He defeated army after army. They had a peaceful time. So David had a good time, and now he's plunged back to this thing, maybe even worse than the things he'd done before, because it's his own family doing this to him. He has a deep love for the kingdom now that for Israel, since he's been king. So, we see, and as I mention every week to us, that David is a man after God's own heart. So we still need to keep watching David very closely here and see what he does, because it's like what a man that earns that title written in the Bible, look closely at his life and what he did and what choices he made. And as we've seen before, he's made bad choices. He's made good choices and he's made bad choices, but he never was. That title of a man after God's own heart was never taken away from him. So we need to look and see what David did and how he retained such height in the Lord's eyes in spite of everything that happened to him. Do y'all want to answer a couple questions today? Anybody into it? Okay. What methods did Absalom use to steal the people's hearts? Pretend. Yeah. He loved them all. And it says, how do people today steal hearts? Nothing's different. Times changed. We don't ride in chariots anymore. We have tanks and missiles, but people are basically just the same, the thoughts. How did Absalom use religion to gain his ends?
He played it up because he knew that would get to David and make David think more favorably of him.
Yeah. He acted like that, he needed to go back and that he had vowed to the Lord while he was gone. So, he knew his daddy did. He knew where he lay. For what false purposes do people use religion today?
To gain power,
True. That's true. You know, we do in lots of ways to have people think, you know, you're a good person when when maybe you have evil intent, like Absalom did. How does the energy of evil men put to shame the children of light? Hope y'all know the answer to this. How does the energy of evil men put to shame the children of light?
It degrades them, pretty much. I mean, the energy of somebody that's evil, I mean, they might try to, if they're feeling a big power, I mean, they might try to shame somebody who's, you know, more subtle or more at ease, you know.
That doesn't have that charisma, I guess, maybe.
Yeah, when the evil men who are so suave and so, and like I said, Absalom was good looking and had all these things going, seemed to be going for him, compared to Joe Smo on the corner, who might be the strongest believer in the whole city, but he didn't really have anything going for him in the world's eyes.
Yes.
So the ones that the energy that these evil men are putting into making themselves look good is making the really good ones look like, you're not really important. You're not really what I want. I want all these good looking things over here.
That outer appearance that they're looking at. When I was thinking of the Antichrist. You know, he's going to have to make himself look really good and override any truly good that he's, you know, that people are going to choose him over what is truly good from the inside. And sometimes you can't see, like you say, the good. You see the outer appearance and you don't see the heart like the Lord did. So thanks for answering us.
Still kind of got me going on the right track.
Says, did David suspect Absalom's actions? Yeah. He had truly forgiven him and loved him and I guess expected that.
Yeah. But I do wonder about these 40 years that Absalom said at the gate, giving people advice and saying that the king didn't have time for him. Somebody should have came to David and told David, hey,
That.
you know, you might want to. Somebody ever did apparently for 40 years.
Well, I wonder, you know, we've been talking about a little bit of slow fade during all this with David, that sometimes maybe things just happen that people just, you know, take for granted. And he's doing good and he's helping David out. And, you know, by being there when maybe he didn't have time, that, you know, something was growing and festering and nobody said a word about it. He must have been really good at what he was doing.
You probably tell them, say, don't worry about bothering the king. Just come to me and I'll help you out. You know,
What's
that's
going to be
fine.
David would have a friend or two who say, hey, did you know that this is going on? I just want to make sure you were aware. Make sure this is okay with you. And I guess he didn't have.
Yeah, unless the friends were kind of maybe taking.
Could have a pick and choose as well. I mean,
That's true too. I didn't think
Yeah,
of that.
and I guess you don't, you're not as suspicious of your child as if it were somebody else doing that maybe he you know, was proud of him for taking a stand and changing and doing that. You wonder, but he seemed to not have a clue of what he was doing. So how did David act and when he learned of the rebellion?
Well, I guess he might have been shocked that it was
Yeah.
maybe more hurt than
More hurt than angry. Yeah, and probably was. That's probably a good point, that because it was his son, he was hurt.
And going into hiding, he felt was the thing to do because, according to what he's talking about here, that he was trying to spare Jerusalem from being besieged. So he was trying to help the people out. But I think also he probably needed that time because he was shocked. He needs that time to regroup and go, what am I going to do now?
Yeah,
So he was hiding so that he could have time to figure it all out without everybody coming to him and pressing in on him and saying, what are you going to do for us?
and yeah, and you know, in times past, David had gone to the Lord to ask. And like you say, maybe he did want that time to get away, to not destroy his kingdom by trying to save it in the long run. So, all right. Next week we're going to be in 2 Samuel verses 18. So talking a little bit more about Absalom and what happens after this point. Okay. So if you don't care, if you'll be back with us at 11 for Brother Buford's message this morning.